in this video, I'm going to talk about the sine and cosine data graph. And before we graph it, we need to know the points in order to graph it. And I just plotted some points on the axis, and I wrote the coordinate. And the first coordinate we start from here, like data, and we goes counterclockwise direction. And for the first coordinate is 1, 0, and for the next coordinate is 0, 1. But we need to be careful. We need to know that before we graph it, we are going 90 degrees counterclockwise directions in order to get to the next point. So that means the intervals of each point should be 90 degrees. So 90 degrees, which means, so 90 degrees should be equal to pi over 2 radians. It is because we know that 180 degrees is equal to pi radian, and if we divide 2 to the both sides, and the left side we're going to be 90 degrees should be equal to pi over 2 radians. So that's why we call it pi over 2. And also the reason why there are 4 radians is because we are going 4 times counterclockwise direction to get to the original point again. So let's graph it, and here's our 4 points. And for the first points, we need to be careful. We also need to know that this first line represents the maximum point of the y value, because we're right now graphing with sine data graph, which will gonna be 1 in this case, so 1. And the last line, the shows and represents the minimum point of the y value, which in this case will gonna be -1. So let's graph it. At first, in the first value, in the first coordinate, the y value we're gonna be 0, so it starts from 0. So here, and we go to counterclockwise direction, and the y value we're gonna be 1. So I plot 1 here. And then if we also go to 90 degrees counterclockwise direction, it will be a -1, 0. But we need to be careful here. Before we plot this, we need to know the each intervals. So in each interval's value, and 0, which means 0, the value of 0 in this case. And it goes counterclock. Let me erase this a little bit. So it goes counterclockwise direction, 90 degrees. So we know that this is 90 degrees, so we go to counterclockwise direction, which will be 90 degrees. And we learned that 90 degrees is pi over 2, so I'm going to write pi over 2. And if you go to 90 degrees again, counterclockwise direction, we know that it is right now 180 degrees. It will be 180 degrees, which means 2 times 90 degrees, it will going to be pi. And for the next term, it will going to be, if you go to 90 degrees again, we're going to be 270 degrees. And it will going to be 3 pi over 2. And for the last point, if we go to again, we have traveled 360 degrees, so we're going to be 2 pi. So let's graph it. So at first we said that the first point is 0, so we do for 0. And for the next point, the value is equal to 1. So I draw 1. And for the next value, it is equal to 0. So go to 0 again. We are going down again. And for the last point, it will going to be -1 for the y value. And then it will come back again, and it will going to be 0 again. So let me graph this graph. This is our sine data graph, and that means we are finding every y values in the coordinates, while the data travels counterclockwise direction. Let's graph the cosine data graph, and for the cosine data graph, we are recording, we're drawing every point of the x value in the coordinate. So at first, the x value will start from here again. It's going to be 1. So we start from 1. And we also go to counterclockwise direction, which will gonna be equal to 0. we go to 0. We're going down again. And 90 degrees again, it will going to be -1. So -1. And for the last point, it will going to be 0. So you go to 0 again. And then it will keep going and it will be 1 again. So let me graph this cosine data's graph. So we draw the cosine data's graph. If you look at this graph carefully, if you move the sine data's graph for about pi over 2, which is 90 degrees, the sine data's graph and the cosine data's graph will be equivalent together. This was the main point of this graph right over here. And we can also look at the points where the sine data's graph and the cosine data's graph meets together. And that's the point where the sine data and the cosine data's values are same. So we are finished with the sine and cosine data's graph. In the next video, we're going to talk about the tangent data's graph.